She couldn't speak. She couldn't scream. She couldn't even whisper her own name. For 22 years, she served in silence. Invisible. Discarded. Treated like furniture in a house full of wolves. And the most feared alpha in the entire North? He walked past her every single day. He never once looked down. But I need you to stay with me tonight. Because by the end of this story, you are going to watch that man get on his knees. And she is not going to say a word. She won't need to. Let me ask you something. What do you do when the world decides you don't exist? Not that you're unimportant. Not that you're overlooked. I mean truly, completely invisible, like the air itself doesn't register your presence. You learn to watch. You learn to notice what others miss. You learn that silence is not the absence of power. It is power. Waiting. Our girl tonight has been waiting her whole life. 22 years of mornings she woke up and could not speak. 22 years of writing her thoughts on scraps of paper. 22 years of watching people talk past her, over her, through her, like she was made of air. She is a maid. The lowest rank in a fortress full of wolves and warriors. And the man she serves? Scarred from a war he never talks about. Feared by every alpha from the north coast to the Dead Mountains. Ruler of the Black Raven Pack. A man who has refused every Luna match for 7 years. They say he has no mate. They say he never will. They are about to be very, very wrong. Because somewhere in that fortress, in the kitchens, in the corridors, in the quiet gray spaces between power and nothing, a girl who cannot speak is carrying something ancient inside her chest. Something that chose her before she was born. Something the wolves already know about. Something he is about to feel for the very first time. Stay with me tonight. I promise you, this story will not let you go. Before we go any further, I need 1 second of your time. Just one. If you have ever felt unseen, if you have ever been in a room full of people and felt completely alone, if you have ever had something burning inside you that no one around you could recognize, then this story was written for you. And the only thing I ask is this. If tonight means something to you, if this voice, this story, this space we are building together means anything at all, hit that like button. Not for the algorithm. Not for me. For her. For every quiet person who was never given a stage. And if you are not subscribed yet, I genuinely do not understand why you are still here without doing that one single thing. You have been listening. You have been feeling it. You are already one of us. Tap subscribe. Turn on notifications. And let's begin. She woke before dawn, like she always did. Not because anyone asked her to. Not because there was warmth waiting on the other side of sleep. She woke because in a fortress that ran on fear and order, being late meant being noticed, and being noticed meant being punished, and she had learned a long time ago that the safest thing a mute girl could be was furniture. She dressed in the dark. Gray linen. Hair pinned flat. Hands scrubbed clean before anyone else's eyes were open. Her name was Zara Voss. No one used it. The other maids called her Ghost. Not cruelly, or maybe cruelly, it was hard to tell, but because she moved through the corridors without sound and seemed to appear in doorways without warning, and after a while people stopped being startled and started just not seeing her at all. She preferred it that way. The fortress of Black Raven rose out of the northern cliffs like a wound that had never healed properly. All stone and shadow. Banners of black silk with the silver raven crest hanging from every tower. The wind was always sharp here, always smelling of pine and ice and something older beneath it, something that breathed up through the rock from deep in the mountain's heart. Zara had lived here for 3 years. She had not chosen it. But she had survived it. She carried her first load of firewood to the east corridor before the sun touched the peaks. Past the guards who didn't look at her. Past the senior maid, Helka, who was already barking at 2 younger girls about the state of the dining hall floors. Past the great iron doors of the war room, which were always closed, always loud, always full of voices she was never meant to hear. She heard everything. That was the other thing about being invisible. The world talked freely in front of furniture. She stacked the wood in the grate of the corridor alcove and straightened up, and that is when she saw him. The Alpha. Kale Draven. He was coming from the far end of the corridor, already dressed, already moving like a man who had somewhere to be and no patience for the distance between here and there. He was taller than she remembered, she always forgot, somehow, until he was in the same space. The scar on the left side of his face ran from his jaw up across his cheekbone, pale against his skin, old and deep and never once explained. He walked straight past her. The air from his passing moved the loose strand of hair at her temple. He did not look down. She watched his back until he turned the corner, then looked down at her hands, still holding a log of firewood, and felt something she had no name for settle heavy in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Not sadness. She knew sadness. Something hold her. She pushed it down, the way she pushed everything down, and went back to work. By midday she had laid 6 fires, polished 4 corridors, carried 2 breakfast trays to officers who didn't thank her, and overheard a conversation she was not supposed to. It was the steward, a thin, nervous man named Aldrich, speaking in a doorway to someone she couldn't see. The East Gate. After the 3rd bell. They'll be inside before the patrol turns. A pause. He won't know until it's done. She stood very still in the alcove 3 feet away, a cleaning cloth in both hands, heart loud in her ears. They were not talking about a shipment. They were not talking about a delivery. She knew what after the 3rd bell meant in this fortress. She knew what inside before the patrol turns meant. Someone was going to move against the Alpha. Tonight. She needed to warn him. She looked down at her hands. At her cleaning cloth. At the absolute absence of a voice in her throat that had been empty of sound for as long as she could remember. She went to the kitchen, found a scrap of parchment, borrowed a stick of charcoal. She wrote the warning, 14 words, and folded it once. She walked to his study. She knocked. No answer. She slipped inside. The room was empty, the window open, the cold coming through in long thin fingers. She pressed the parchment flat against the glass and leaned it there, visible, impossible to miss. Then she left. 2 hours later, she passed the study again on her way to the linen room. The window was closed. The parchment was gone. But not read, she could see from the doorway that it was crumpled in the bin beside his desk, still folded. Still sealed. He had cleared the windowsill without opening it. Without reading it. Without knowing she had been there at all. She stood in the corridor for a long moment, the stone cold beneath her feet, the distant sound of wolves on the outer walls threading through the air. Then she went to the linen room and folded sheets until the 3rd bell rang. And when it rang, when the sound rolled through the fortress walls and into her bones, she counted the seconds and waited. 3 minutes later, she heard shouting from the East Gate. Then silence. Then boots, fast and heavy, running toward the war room. He had known. He had found out another way. She leaned her forehead against the cold stone wall and breathed out slowly. He was safe. And he still had no idea she existed. 3 days after the East Gate, things changed. Not dramatically. Not in any way that had a name or an announcement. Just a quiet shift, the kind of change you feel before you can see it, like pressure in the air before rain. Zara's duties were reassigned. She was moved from the east corridor to the inner wing. Closer to his chambers. She told herself it was a coincidence. Helka had been reorganizing the maid rotations all month, and it meant nothing that Zara's new route now took her past the Alpha study twice a day. It meant nothing that she was now the one responsible for his morning fire, his afternoon water, the oil in the lamps outside his private door. She told herself that. She almost believed it. The first morning on the new route, she arrived before dawn and laid the fire in his study grate in complete silence. She was nearly finished when the door opened behind her. She didn't turn around. The furniture didn't turn around. "You're the one who cleared the window 3 nights ago." It wasn't a question. She turned. He was standing in the doorway in a dark shirt with the sleeves pushed up, hair still rough from sleep, the scar on his face catching the low light from the newly lit fire. He was looking at her, actually looking at her, with an expression she couldn't read. She stood up straight and reached into her apron pocket. Drew out the small leather notepad she carried everywhere. Wrote 3 words and held it up to him. "You didn't read it." "I don't read and sign notes left on my windowsill." She wrote again and held it up. There was no time to sign it. Someone was planning to breach the east gate after the third bell. I know. We had intelligence for 2 days. She looked at him. She wrote and held it up. Then why didn't you act sooner? Because I needed to know who opened the gate from inside. She understood. He had let the threat approach far enough to reveal the informant. Strategy. The kind of thinking that made men afraid of him. She nodded once, put the notepad away, and turned back to the fire. You're the mute girl. She paused. She didn't turn around. What's your name? She held the notepad over her shoulder. Zara. Zara. He said it like he was testing the weight of it. How long have you been in this fortress? She held the notepad back again. 3 years. Another pause. Longer this time. She could feel him doing the arithmetic, 3 years, and he had never once known her name. She didn't make it easy for him. She finished laying the fire. When she stood to leave, he was still in the doorway, not quite blocking it, not quite stepping aside. She met his eyes briefly, just briefly, and then looked away and slipped past him into the corridor. She made it 6 steps before he spoke again. Zara. She stopped. Did not turn. Thank you. For the note. Even if I didn't read it. She stood in the corridor for exactly 2 seconds. Then she walked away. She did not let herself feel anything about those 2 words until she was alone in the linen room with the door shut. Then she pressed her back against the cold stone, closed her eyes, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of being seen, for the first time in 3 years, by someone who mattered. It was terrifying. She did not examine why it was terrifying. She went back to work. Over the following week, she learned the way she learned everything, by watching. He rose before dawn and never explained it. He ate alone. He held war councils that lasted until midnight and then walked the walls alone afterward, for sometimes 2 hours, in the dark, in the cold, without any guard. He was not a cruel man. She had expected cruelty. Everything she had heard before coming to this fortress had said cruelty. What she found was a man who carried something so heavy that cruelty would have been lighter. She saw him stop in the lower courtyard one afternoon to let a stable boy, 8 years old, terrified, demonstrate something with a sling and stone. He watched the whole demonstration without impatience. He corrected the boy's grip with 2 words and a gesture. When the boy's next shot went straight, the alpha nodded once, said nothing more, and walked away. The boy stared after him like he'd been knighted. She saw the scar in full light for the first time that week, when he was reading dispatches by the window in his study and she was resetting the fire. The wound was old, years old, and ran deeper than it first appeared. Not clean. Not a blade. Something tearing. He caught her looking. She looked away immediately. It happened 7 years ago. He said it flatly, not an invitation but not a wall either. Just information. She wrote and held it up. You don't have to explain it. I know. She looked up. The one who gave it to me is dead. I made sure of that. She wrote and held it up. Does it still hurt? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then. Yes. She didn't write anything else. Neither did he say anything else. But something between them, quiet and unnamed, settled into place like a beam slotting into a wall. Not trust yet. Too early for trust. Something that came before trust, the decision to stop pretending the other person wasn't there. She finished the fire. She left. And the scar still hurts after 7 years. That was not the wound of a battle. That was the wound of a loss. She wondered what he had lost. She told herself it was none of her concern. She thought about it for the rest of the night. It was Helka who sent her to the forest edge. Not kindly. Helka did nothing kindly. She thrust a basket at Zara after supper and said the healer needed blackroot and frostcap mushrooms from the tree line before morning, and all the other maids had refused because it was nearly dark and the outer wolves had been restless all week, and you, she pointed at Zara, you don't complain anyway. Which was true. Zara couldn't complain out loud. That was Helka's way of calling it a compliment. She took the basket. The path to the forest edge ran along the outer wall and then down a slope of rough grass that turned silver in the evening light. Beyond the grass, the trees began old growth, black pines thick as towers, the kind of forest that felt like it had opinions about you. The kind that watched. Zara had never been afraid of the forest. She was afraid of most things she would admit to, but not the forest. Silence recognized silence. She and the trees had an understanding. She found the black root quickly, pulling it from the base of a cluster of stones where the damp gathered. The frostcap took longer. She had to move deeper into the first ring of trees, crouching low, turning over the rotting bark of a fallen pine. She heard it before she saw it. Not footsteps. Not a branch. Something else, a weight shifting in the brush to her left, deliberate, slow. She stayed very still, hand flat on the ground, and did not breathe. When she looked up, the wolf was already watching her. It was enormous. Silver-white, the color of the sky just before full dark. One of Kale's pack, she recognized it by size, by the way it carried itself, too composed to be feral. These wolves understood commands. These wolves were trained. They did not approach humans who were not their alpha. This one was 7 feet away and closing. She should have run. She knew she should have run. She didn't. The wolf stopped 3 feet from her and lowered its great head, not a threat posture. Not an approach for food. A bow. Slow. Deliberate. Unmistakable. She stared at it. Her hand, her right hand, still pressed flat against the damp earth, began to warm. Not from the ground. From inside. She lifted it and looked at her palm. Nothing visible. But the warmth was there, spreading from her wrist to her fingers, bright and deep and alive in a way that had no explanation. She held her hand out slowly, the way you would to any animal asking to be understood. The wolf pressed its nose once to her palm. And then she heard it. Not in her ears. In her chest. In the space behind her ribs where sound shouldn't live, a word, low and old and spoken in a voice she had never heard before, and yet knew the way you know your own heartbeat. Luna. She pulled her hand back. The wolf lifted its head and looked at her with amber eyes that were too knowing, too patient, too certain of something she had not yet been told. Then it turned and disappeared into the trees without a sound. She knelt on the forest floor for a long time. Her basket was forgotten. Her right hand pressed against her sternum like she was checking for damage. Luna. She knew what the word meant. Every person in a wolf pack knew what it meant. Luna was Alpha's mate. The Alpha's other half. The source of the bond that grounded him, steadied his power, kept the pack whole. It was not a servant's word. It was not a mute girl's word. It was not hers. She picked up her basket. She gathered the rest of the frostcap in silence. She walked back to the fortress with steady feet and a completely steady face. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the dark and looked at her right hand until her eyes adjusted to the night. Nothing to see. No mark. No glow. Only her own palm, familiar and plain. But the warmth was still there. And the word, that single, ancient word, was still sounding somewhere deep in her chest, like a note struck on a bell that no one else could hear. She did not write it down. She did not tell anyone. She folded her hands in her lap and sat with it in the dark, the way she sat with everything she could not say. She had spent her whole life being called ghost. And here, in the dark, in the silence, with her right hand still warm from a wolf's breath, she heard herself called something else entirely. The visiting Alpha arrived on a Tuesday. His name was Reth Ashmore. He ruled the eastern coast, 3 packs, 12 settlements, and a reputation for being exactly the kind of man who arrived somewhere and immediately started measuring how everything compared to himself. He came with an entourage of 6. He arrived 2 hours early. He walked into the main hall like he owned it and looked at Kale Draven like a man calculating whether he could win. Zara was serving water at the far end of the long table when Reth entered. She moved to the wall, basket in hand, as the men exchanged the formal greeting of senior alphas, a brief clasp of forearms, no warmth, all performance. She watched Reth's eyes move around the hall. They stopped on her. Not the way Kale's eyes had recently begun to stop on her, with that particular quality of attention that meant he was actually thinking about what he saw. Reth's eyes stopped on her the way a man's eyes stop on something he's decided has no opinion about being looked at. She looked at the floor. Is this one mute? I've heard you keep a mute maid. Useful, I imagine, can't gossip. Several of his men laughed. She kept her eyes on the floor. What's wrong with your tongue, girl? She said nothing. She had never been able to say anything. Look at me when I'm speaking to you. She looked up. He was closer than she'd realized. He'd moved while she was looking down, and now he was 3 feet away, and his hand came out and closed around her wrist, not hard but not gentle, the kind of grip that said he didn't expect any resistance. The warmth hit her palm like a struck match. It wasn't a decision. It wasn't a choice. It moved through her before she could stop it, from her wrist to her fingertips, and she looked Reth Ashmore directly in the eyes, not deference, not fear, just looked at him with the full, flat weight of something that had been asleep for 22 years and was no longer interested in pretending. He let go of her wrist. He stepped back. He didn't seem to know he'd done it. His face didn't change, he recovered quickly, smiled, looked away like the whole moment hadn't happened. But his wolf, the great black wolf that had come in with his entourage and sat quietly by the door, it whined. Once. Short. Low. A submission sound. Reth's head snapped toward it, confused. Zara lowered her eyes and stepped back to the wall, her heart banging against her ribs like it was trying to get out. She did not look up. But she felt it without looking, the sudden, total weight of Cale's attention from the head of the table. He had seen everything. The formal dinner lasted 3 hours. She served without incident. Eyes down. Hands steady. Face blank. She was furniture again, and the furniture was safe. After the hall cleared and the servants began to clean and carry dishes back to the kitchens, she was wiping down the far end of the table when she heard boots stop behind her. She turned. He stood with his arms folded, looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the measuring look. Not the flat command look. Something more open than that, and more unsettled. What did you do? She reached for her notepad and held it up. I don't know what you mean. His wolf submitted to you. She wrote and held it up. Dogs are unpredictable. Not Ashmore's wolf. That animal hasn't submitted to anyone but Reth in 11 years. What did you do? She looked down at her right hand. The warmth was gone now, faded the moment Reth released her, like a flame pulled back into its source. Her palm looked ordinary. Harmless. Hers. She wrote the only honest thing she had and held it up slowly. I don't know yet. He looked at the notepad for a long time. Then he looked at her hand. Then he looked at her face. Have you always been able to do that? She shook her head. When did it start? She thought of the forest. The silver wolf. The words spoken in the dark behind her ribs. She wrote and held it up. Recently. He nodded slowly. He didn't look frightened. He looked like a man who had just picked up a piece of a puzzle he'd been missing for a long time, and was not yet sure whether it changed the picture for better or worse. Come to my study. After the fortress quiets. She looked at him. She wrote and held it up. Why? Because I need to speak to someone who can't repeat what I tell them. She stood in the empty hall for a long moment after he left. She thought about the East Gate. The warning he hadn't read. The way he'd said her name like he was learning the weight of it. She thought about Reth Ashmore's wolf going to its belly without being asked. She thought about the warmth in her hand. She went to his study. The elder arrived without warning on a gray Thursday morning. No letter. No messenger. No formal notice of any kind. One moment the main gate was closed and the next it was open, and through it came an old man on foot, no horse, no escort, no bags, wearing a traveling coat the color of dried bark, moving across the courtyard with the particular unhurried certainty of someone who had never once in their life doubted where they were going. His name, Zara learned from the kitchen whispers, was Pevrin. He had no pack title. No territory. He belonged to the Elder Council, the oldest body in Wolf Society, men and women who answered to no alpha and were answered to by everyone. She paid him no more attention than that. She was delivering the midday meal to the officers' hall when Pevrin walked into the kitchen. He stopped. He looked at her. Not the way people looked at her, through her, past her. He looked at her the way the silver wolf had looked at her in the forest. Like he recognized her. Like he had been looking for something for a very long time and had found it in the least expected place and had the grace not to look surprised. "Child," he said, and his voice was the kind of old that precedes earthquakes. "Set down the tray." She set it down. "Come here." She came. He took her right hand in both of his, gnarled, warm, certain, and turned it palm up. He looked at it for a long moment without touching the skin. Just looking. Like he was reading something written there in a language too old for her to see. Then he looked up at her face. "You are not mute." She opened her mouth on instinct, the old, familiar reflex of trying and failing, and then stopped. "You have never been mute," he said. "Your voice was sealed. At birth. By your mother, before she." He paused. Something crossed his face that looked almost like grief. Before she ran out of time. The kitchen around her felt very far away. She reached for her notepad, her hand not steady for the first time in years, and held it up. "What does that mean?" "It means you are not who this fortress believes you to be. You are not a maid. You were not placed here by coincidence." She held up the notepad again. "Then what am I?" He looked at her for a long moment. "You are the last daughter of the Asheron bloodline." She stared at him. "A line that predates every current Alpha house by 300 years. The Asheron were the original Lunas, not mated to any single Alpha, but the source line from which all Luna power flows. When the bloodline was hunted, 23 years ago, your mother sealed your voice to hide you. Primal Luna power is detectable. It has a sound. Silence was your armor." He released her hand. "The seal is breaking now. Because you have found him." She was not breathing. She held up the notepad. "Found who?" He looked at her with great patience and great sadness. "The Alpha. The one your power recognizes. It is not a coincidence that you are here, in this fortress, in this pack. The bond called you here long before either of you understood what the call was." She sat down on the kitchen floor. Not gracefully. Simply sat, because her legs decided they were finished standing. Peverin waited. After a moment she held up the notepad. "His scar." "Yes." She held it up again. "The war that made it. My bloodline. The same war." "Yes. The same enemies. You are, both of you, the last people standing from the same catastrophe." He knelt, an old man kneeling in the kitchen, entirely unbothered by the indignity. "He does not know yet. He cannot be told by me. It must come from you." She looked at the notepad in her hands. At the blank page. At the endless, quiet absence of a voice she had never been allowed to have. She wrote one thing. I looked at the words for a long moment. Then she tore the page out and folded it once. She stood up. She walked out of the kitchen, down the corridor, up the east staircase, to the door of Cale Draven's private study. She knocked. He opened the door. She held up the folded page without meeting his eyes. He took it. I opened it. She watched him read it. She had written 4 words. "You knew my family." She watched his face. She watched the exact moment he understood. She watched 7 years of something he had never allowed anyone to see move across his face all at once: grief, recognition, the sudden violent rearrangement of everything he thought he knew, and then she watched him press it all back down behind his eyes with the practice of a man who had been doing exactly that for 7 years. He looked at her. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then he said, in a voice so quiet she almost couldn't hear it, "Come inside." She went inside. He closed the door. He didn't speak for a long time. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, both hands flat on the sill, looking out at the gray courtyard below. She could see his shoulders carrying whatever the last 10 minutes had placed on them, carrying it the way he carried everything, without complaint, without visible collapse, with the particular rigidity of a man who has decided that breaking is not available to him. She stood near the door and gave him the silence. She was good at silence. The Asheron line. She waited. I was told they were all dead. She held up the notepad. My mother made sure they believed that. He turned. His face was composed. Or it was trying to be composed. The effort showed at the edges, in his jaw, in the slight unsteadiness around his eyes. How old were you when she sealed your voice? She wrote and held it up. Hours. She ran before I was a day old. She placed the seal and I was found by a traveling family who brought me south. I grew up with no voice and no explanation and eventually ended up here. He read the page slowly. She saved your life. She wrote and held it up. She died 3 weeks later. I found that out when I was 12. I saw her name in a pack death record from the Northern Territories. He closed his eyes briefly. I was there. In the Northern Territories. During the war. He touched the scar without seeming to notice he was doing it. I was 17. I fought in the last battle. I was the only one of my regiment who. He stopped. I spent 20 years believing I had failed everyone I was supposed to protect. She held up the notepad. You didn't know there was a child? No. She wrote and held it up. Then you didn't fail her. You didn't know what to look for. He looked at the notepad. He looked at her. You're very calm about this. She wrote and held it up. I'm not calm. I've been sitting with this for 20 minutes and I think I might collapse. But I've been silent my whole life. I've had a lot of practice looking calm. Something moved across his face that she had never seen before. It took her a moment to name it. The edge of a smile. Not the performative command of a ruler. Something involuntary. Something that arrived before he could manage it. Gone in a second. But there. He looked away. The elder said the bond called you here. Flat. Factual. Testing the words the way you test ice before crossing. She held up the notepad. Yes. I don't believe in. She was already writing. She held it up before he finished. I know. He looked at the notepad. You wrote that before I finished the sentence. She wrote and held it up. You were going to say you don't believe in fated bonds. Every alpha says they don't believe in fated bonds. They say it right up until the moment they're standing in front of their Luna and their scar stops hurting for the first time in 7 years. He was very still. She hadn't meant to write that much. She pressed her lips together and looked at the notepad. What did you say? She looked up. She crossed the room. She had no explanation for why she did it, no plan, no thought before the movement, no moment of deciding, only her hand rising and pressing flat against the left side of his face, against the old scar, palm warm, the warmth already moving out of her and into him like a current finding the path it was always meant to take. He went completely still. Under her hand he became something simpler, just a man, standing in his study in the morning light, with his eyes closed and his breathing slow and the scar under her palm that had hurt for 7 years going, for the first time, quiet. Neither of them spoke. After a long time he reached up and covered her hand with his, not moving it away, just holding it there, keeping her where she was. I don't know how to do this, he said, very quietly, as if the words cost him something significant. She used her free hand to write and turned the notepad so he could see it. Neither do I. But I know what I am now. And I think you do too. He opened his eyes. He read the words. He looked at her. You need to understand, he said, that there will be people who do not want this. The council. The other packs. People who would rather finish what started 23 years ago. She held up the notepad. I know. And you're not frightened. She looked at him steadily and held up the notepad. I've been frightened my whole life. I've just been very good at being quiet about it. He looked at her for a long, measuring moment. Then he nodded once, not agreement, but recognition. The kind a man gives when he meets someone who has been carrying the same weight in a different shape. He released her hand. He stepped back. He was the alpha again, composed, calculating, already thinking about the walls that would need to go up before anything else could go wrong. But the scar was quiet. She saw it in the way he held his face, the particular absence of tension around his jaw, the small, involuntary relaxation of something he had been bracing against for so long he'd forgotten it was possible to stop. She put the notepad away. She went to the door. Zara. She stopped. Don't disappear. You've been invisible in this fortress for 3 years. I would prefer you to stop. She stood with her back to him for a moment. Then she nodded once. And walked away. They came at night. Not through the east gate this time, they'd learned from that. They came through the mountain passage, the old tunnel cut into the rock beneath the fortress 3 centuries ago and supposedly sealed. Someone had unsealed it. Someone with old knowledge and a specific purpose. Zara woke to the sound of wolves, not the outer pack's usual patrol cry, but a different sound. Shorter. Harder. The sound that meant the pack had found something it recognized as a direct threat. She was on her feet before she was fully awake. She went to her small window and looked out at the inner courtyard. Torches everywhere suddenly, guards running. From the east wing she could hear combat, not the training ground rhythm, the real kind. Shorter. Uglier. She pulled on her clothes and went into the corridor. A guard ran past her. Get back to your room. She grabbed his arm. Held up her notepad. Where is the Alpha? In her hall. 7 intruders from the mountain passage. They are not here for us. He hesitated. They are looking for someone. Get back to your room and stay there. He ran. She stood in the corridor. They are looking for someone. She thought of Peverin's voice in the kitchen. The seal is breaking because the power is detectable now. Primal Luna power has a sound. She thought of 23 years of her mother running. Of death records from the Northern Territories. Of enemies who had spent 23 years making sure they were the last ones. She was who they were looking for. And Kale was between them and her without knowing it. She ran toward the inner hall. She heard it before she turned the final corner. 3 against 1, she could tell by the rhythm, by the number of different footsteps underneath the clash of weapons. She pressed herself against the wall and looked around the corner. 3 of them. Armed, coordinated, moving in a pattern that said professional. They were not bandits. They were not soldiers. They were hunters, and they hunted one specific kind of prey. Kale was holding them. He was extraordinary, she had always understood it abstractly, but seeing it in the flickering torchlight was different from understanding it. He was outnumbered and he was managing it, barely, his left arm bleeding from a wound across the forearm, his jaw tight. Managing it, until one of them moved wide and came in at an angle he couldn't cover. The blade caught him across the right side, beneath his arm. Not a killing wound. But he dropped to one knee. She watched him drop to one knee and something in her chest tore open. Not fear. Not only fear. The warmth came back. It didn't rise slowly this time. It didn't ask permission. It detonated, from her sternum outward, down through her arms and into her hands, up through her throat, and she opened her mouth and she didn't think and she didn't decide and she did not calculate. She spoke. One word. It was not loud. It did not need to be loud. It had the particular quality of a sound that exists in a frequency other sounds cannot challenge, old, absolute, the kind of authority that predates language. She said. Kneel. All 3 of them went to the floor. Not stumbled. Not flinched. Knelt, completely, immediately, like marionettes with their strings cut simultaneously. Their weapons clattered against the stone. Their wolves, which had been snarling at the edges of the hall, went silent and flat. The silence after it was total. Zara stood in the torchlight at the entrance to the hall, her hand still raised, her chest heaving, her eyes burning. Her voice. Her voice. She had spoken one word and it had moved through the air like a physical thing, like something with weight and consequence, and the hall had answered it. She was trembling. She was not certain she would stay standing. Kale lifted his head from his knee. He looked at the 3 men on the floor. He looked at her. The blood on his side was real. The wound was real. And in his eyes, behind the pain, behind the shock, was the slow, total rearrangement of everything he had still been telling himself might not be true. She walked to him. She knelt in front of him, not in submission, just to reach his level, and pressed both hands against the wound on his side. The warmth moved into him immediately, through her palms, and she felt him go still under it the same way he'd gone still when she touched his scar. His hand came up and covered hers. "How?" he said. His voice was not steady. "How did you?" She had no notepad in her hands. She looked at him. And she opened her mouth. "I don't know how long I have it," she said. Her voice was rough from 22 years of disuse, low and careful, shaped around each word like she was learning the feel of them as she went. "The seal breaking. It may not stay. You're speaking. I know. Don't make a thing of it. You're bleeding." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was close to one. She kept her hands on the wound and did not look away from his face. Around them, the 3 hunters knelt on the stone floor, still and silent, held by a word that lingered in the air long after it should have faded. Cale's pack arrived 2 minutes later and took them into custody. Zara stayed where she was. And Cale Draven, who had not needed anyone's hands on his wounds in 7 years, who had not let anyone that close to the part of him that hurt, did not move away. The council met 3 days later. 7 elders, 4 senior pack officers, and 2 representatives from the neighboring territories, all summoned by Pevrin, who had still not left the fortress, who had been waiting with the patience of someone who had done this before and knew exactly how it would go. Zara stood at the edge of the chamber. She listened. The debate was not complicated. It had the particular shape of all debates that look complicated but are actually simple. The council was afraid, and afraid people dress their fear in the language of law and precedent and procedure so they don't have to admit it as fear. The arguments were these. The Ashran bloodline was unverified. A primal Luna without verified lineage documentation could not be formally recognized. A bond between a recognized alpha and an unverified Luna would be contested by every aligned pack. The political consequences were significant. The timing was poor. There were processes for this. There were systems. There was a right way to do things. Pevrin sat in the elder's chair at the head of the table and listened to all of it with the expression of a man watching a very predictable play he had seen many times. Cale stood at the opposite end of the table with his arms folded and listened to all of it with no expression at all. When the room reached the point where it had exhausted its reasons and was beginning to repeat itself, one of the senior council members, a man named Wick, gray-haired and precise, turned to Cale and said, "The Alpha will understand that until verification is complete, the girl returns to maid duties or is removed from the fortress entirely. Those are the options the council can offer at this time." The room waited. Cale was quiet. Zara watched him from the edge of the chamber. She had prepared herself for this moment with 3 days of clear-eyed pragmatism. She was used to being removed. She was used to being the wrong shape for the space she'd been placed in. She was used to being the answer to questions no one had asked. She had her notepad in her hands. She did not get to use it. Cale unfolded his arms. He looked at Wick. He looked at each of the 7 elders in turn, slowly, without hurry. Then he turned. He walked the length of the room. He stopped in front of Zara. And in front of the council, the elders, the officers, and the 2 territorial representatives, in front of everyone who held any power over anything in the northern territories. Cale Draven went to one knee. The room made a sound like all the air being removed at once. He didn't look up. "She is my Luna. I will not stand until this pack acknowledges what I already know." Zara stared at the top of his head. At his shoulder, bent. The line of his spine. The scar on his face that the morning light was catching from the left. She thought about the East Gate warning he hadn't read. She thought about the first time he'd said her name. She thought about 22 years of being ghost, of being furniture, of being the thing in the room that no one needed to acknowledge. She thought about her mother running through the northern territories with a newborn and a choice, and making the only choice that kept one of them alive. She thought about a word spoken in a dark forest by a silver wolf. She lifted her hand and placed it on his shoulder. He went still under it. The way he always went was still under her touch. She opened her mouth. And she said his name. Cale. Said it out loud, in her rough, careful, 22-year-old voice, said it like it was the first word she had ever chosen instead of the first word that had ever been forced out of her. The room was completely silent. Pevrin, in the elder's chair, looked at no one in particular and said, quietly but with absolute finality, "Verified." Cale stood. He didn't look at the council. He looked at her. She looked back. Around them, something that had been held in place for 23 years by fear and silence and the determination of a woman who had run out of time. Finally released. She kept the notepad. She didn't need it anymore, or she needed it less, at least, in the way that it had once been the only channel between what she thought and what anyone else could know. Her voice stayed. It was uneven still, some days stronger than others, rough at the edges the way anything long and used is rough when it is finally employed. But it stayed. She kept the notepad anyway. It sat on the windowsill of the room she now had, not the narrow maid's room off the kitchen corridor, but the east-facing room with the wide sill and the view of the mountain and the first light in the morning coming in gold across the stone floor. She didn't write in it. She just left it there. A reminder. Not of limitation. Of everything she had said in silence that had led her here. The silver wolf came back. 3 weeks after the council, on a morning when the frost was still on the grass and the air had the particular held-breath quality of early winter, she went to the forest edge alone and it was there, sitting at the tree line, patient, waiting. She stood on the grass in her coat and looked at it. "How long did you know?" she asked. The wolf looked at her with amber eyes. Did not answer, in the way that wolves do not answer. Before the kitchen. Before the forest, even. She crossed her arms over her chest. "You came to me the first day. I just didn't see it." The wolf blinked. She laughed. Quietly, to herself, a sound that was still strange in her own ears, her own laugh, in her own voice, in the open air. She was still getting used to hearing herself. She heard boots on the grass behind her. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. She had learned the particular rhythm of those footsteps over 3 years of hearing them in corridors and courtyards, even when she was trying not to notice. Cale stopped beside her. He looked at the wolf. The wolf looked at him with the same patient amber gaze. "It's still doing that?" "Yes." "What is it waiting for?" "I think it's just checking. Making sure we're all right." He considered this. "And are we?" She looked at the forest edge. At the old black pines and the particular quality of silence that lived between them, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full, the way all real silences are full of the things that choose to live inside them. She thought about the question seriously, the way she thought about everything, with the particular attention of someone who had spent 22 years understanding that words were not infinite and therefore each one carried weight. "Yes. I think so." He didn't say anything. He reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically. Not with any of the careful, managed control she had watched him apply to everything else in his life. Just reached over and took it, the way people do when the performance is over and what remains is simply the fact of another person being there. The silver wolf stood, stretched, and disappeared back into the trees. She watched the forest close behind it. "I was thinking," Cale said, after a while. "That's never not dangerous. About the East Gate note. If I had read it, the first morning, on the windowsill, I would have found you then. Everything would have happened faster. Or differently," she said. Or differently. She thought about her mother running. About the word sealed inside her before she was a day old. About the shape of everything she hadn't been able to say for 22 years, and how all of it had been moving, quietly, toward this specific morning in this specific place. "I think it happened exactly as fast as it needed to." He squeezed her hand once. She leaned into his side, and for a while there was nothing but the frost on the grass and the wind in the old black pines and the mountain breathing around them, steady and vast and very, very old. She had spent her whole life being the silence in a room full of sound. She understood now that silence was not an absence. It was a shape. And every word she had ever written, every note pressed against glass and folded into palms and held out in lieu of a voice she was not allowed to have. All of it had been the shape of this. Waiting to be said. The blank notepad sat on the windowsill back in the east-facing room. She didn't need it. She kept it anyway. The mountain is quiet now. But it remembers. And so do we. If you are still here. If you sat with her from the very first silence to the very last word. Then you already know what this story was really about. It was never just about a mute maid and a scarred alpha. It was about what happens when someone who has been invisible their whole life finally stops apologizing for taking up space. And I need you to hear me on this. You, the person watching this right now, maybe at midnight, maybe in the dark, maybe with headphones in so no one can hear you feeling something. You are not furniture. You are not the ghost in someone else's story. And if this channel, this voice, this space has given you even 1 hour of feeling like someone understood, then do one thing for me. Subscribe. Not because the algorithm needs it. Because you deserve a place that keeps showing up for you. Hit the bell. Leave a comment, even one word. Tell me, would you have taken her place? Would you have stood at the edge of that council chamber and waited? Or would you have walked away? I want to know. I'll be here. I'm always here. And I'll see you in the next one.